Good afternoon, everybody. How are you doing? Good. I don't know where my moderator is, but I'm Ian Kerr, and I've come here from Canada to speak to you this afternoon. I needed to come here because I needed to warm up. It's like 20 degrees colder in Canada right now, at least where I'm from. I'm super excited to be here in Iceland, where I've really been following for a number of years the issues that are going on in your tech community, in particular in the privacy context. And I'm happy to be here at the invitation of Helga and all of my friends at the Data Protection Authority. And so I'm going to speak to you for the next half hour to try to answer a perhaps very strange question. The question, can robots invade your privacy? And when I say that, I'm talking about whether, quite literally I'm asking not whether the question of could a robot be used to invade your privacy? Of course, the answer to that question is yes. We're not, in other words, talking about the robot as an instrument through which privacy can be invaded. What I want to ask is a very strange question, whether a robot could be said to invade your privacy even if there's no human eyes that ever come in contact with the data or the information. It's kind of like a philosopher's question: if the tree falls in the forest and nobody is there to hear it, if the robot spies on you in the forest and nobody is there to see it, is the robot invading your privacy? Now, the reason I say it's a strange question is because generally when we think of privacy as something which is relational. It's a relationship between two people. But here, we're talking about a situation where, by hypothesis, there's no human being on the other side of the transactions. So to answer this question that I've posed, I think we need to do three things. The first thing is I want to take a bit of a look at a field of study by the name of human-robot interaction. We have a lot of coders in the room, and we have a lot of people who build robots, but there's a broader field of people who are working on how to make those transactions between humans and robots smooth. And if you walk the halls of this conference, you will see that some of the transactions with some of the robots are smoother than others. And that's a field that's quite nascent, and we're trying to work on it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm also going to talk, second, in the middle part of my talk, about privacy doctrine. And I'm a privacy lawyer, and I know that you've just eaten lunch, and I know all about blood chemistry, so I'll keep that part of the talk short. But I will try to impress upon you some very important things about the way that privacy law works and how it becomes a challenge to this question of when robots start to collect data about us and start to act on their own in a kind of way. And then the third element of the talk that I'm going to talk about is an area of philosophy. Again, just after lunch, I think I'll keep that one almost as short as the talk about the lawyers. But we're talking about an area called epistemic privacy. This is privacy about the kind of things that people can come to know about one another. All right, so let's start off. We'll talk a little bit about human-robot interaction. So the first thing I want to do, and this audience is one I don't have to speak very long about, but I want to make sure we're starting on the same page, is to talk a little bit about what a robot is and what I mean by a robot. When I'm talking about a robot, I'm talking about a machine-based system which has three elements. It has the ability to sense its environment. It has the ability to process the information which it has sensed. In other words, to think, to use the paradigm that the robotics people talk about. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, it has the ability to act upon the world. So a robot is not just a thing with a cuddly, cute face that rolls around on wheels. It's something which can sense its environment, process that data which it sensed, and then actuate upon the world. And in thinking through this roboticist paradigm of the sense, think, act, for the purposes of this talk, I want us to imagine that the processing part of the robot is becoming more and more advanced in terms of what artificial intelligence can do to drive that thinking part within the robot. And if this were a longer talk, I'd go into some detail about different approaches to AI and what kinds of AI are possible, and you've heard other speakers talk about it. I'm just going to simply mention for current purposes that when we talk about AI, we can talk about it in a narrow sense, or we could talk about it in a general sense. And right now, we're getting a lot of attention because the field of artificial narrow intelligence is actually starting to make some progress by way of machine learning and other techniques in artificial intelligence. So we're getting very good at having machines do certain narrow tasks. That, of course, is a very different proposition from talking about AGI, or what some people call artificial general intelligence. That's when a machine system would have the ability to have general intelligence in the way that you and I do. I hope, I'll count myself among you. And that those kind of machine system can do many things in an organized way that usually requires and involves cognition at a pretty high level. So there's AGI, and then some people in the community, particularly those who sort of subscribe to a singularitarian point of view, think about things like artificial superintelligence. I'm just curious how many people here have heard of or read Nick Bostrom's book called Superintelligence, just to get a sense. Quite a few hands up in the room, not everybody. In any event, in thinking about that, these people who subscribe to the singularitarian point of view sort of think through it like this. Many of you will have seen a version of this curve. This is Moore's law. And the idea is that, of course, the rate of progression of the processing power of computing machinery has been doubling roughly every year and a half since at least 1958, when Gordon Moore started keeping track of these things. And what we see is an exponential curve. And as a good Canadian, I understand very well the power of an exponential curve. And if you look at where we are now, we're standing on the very blade of what looks to me as a Canadian like a hockey stick. And when you're standing on the blade of the hockey stick and you look, the rest of the thing's going pretty much straight up. And that's supposedly what some people think in terms of the progress of technology. And in fact, Ray Kurzweil, who is one of the proponents of this view, takes it even further and he says, no, there's this thing called the law of accelerated returns. And what that means is we tend to think about technology as a linear progression. So in fact, we underestimate it. And if we correct for that, we'll see that in fact, technology is going to spin along even faster. But the point is, and at least for my purposes, we're here. We're standing at the bottom. We don't know. It could be that it's going to spike like a hockey stick, but it could also look like this, right? It could have a stationary phase. It could have a death phase. This happens to be a chart representing the life cycle of a bacterium. So here we are, and so for the purposes of this talk, I think we shouldn't be distracting ourselves by thinking about general intelligence or superintelligence. Right now, at least from a legal and ethical point of view, there are enough challenges with artificial narrow intelligence. And I think we have to be really careful to stay focused on the here and now, narrow intelligent applications, and think about the issues that they raise for privacy, for equality, for all sorts of the values that we stand accustomed to. So in thinking through that with the robotic paradigm, we can start to see that there's all sorts of little robots and big robots that create new challenges for us. This is a little rover, and I'm going to show you a few in the phase of the development of this rover. And if you sort of look to the top where the antenna is, what you start to see is that the sensors become more and more sophisticated with each round of the technology. So they're able to gather more and more data as they autonomously move through various environments. And some people have played around with these. This, of course, a telepresence operator, got a fair bit of intelligence towards the top. Well, as we start thinking about these kind of technologies, whether we're talking about semi-automated drones in the sky, whether we're talking about the next round of security robots that are already being rolled out, for surveillance purposes, or whether we're talking about these kinds of surveillance devices. And no doubt these are surveillance devices. We can start to think about what some of the privacy implications are. But so far, traditionally, those challenges are when some company or some people are using those robots as an instrument to interfere with privacy. Recall, I want to talk about the ones where there's no humans involved. So we're also starting to make our robots take a bit of a humanoid form. Anybody recognize this robot? Curious? That's a Jibo. And what you see is that Cynthia Brazil and others on her team have recognized that you can get the humans to share more data with the Jibo if the Jibo is cute and cuddly and takes on human characteristics. So we're already tending towards imbuing some kind of personality on these machines, but through human-computer interaction, we can do a lot to get the robots more interesting, and therefore robots which we'll want to engage with more. This is Pepper. Pepper is a frontline robot that's starting to be rolled out in commerce. You can see here Pepper being used in the context of selling fast food. But here I want to show you a quick clip, and I want you to think a little bit about all the things going on in the background with this human interaction with Pepper. Check this out.
So tell me how you can help people in this world.
For example, I'm interested in working in healthcare and helping the elderly. My body language and understanding of basic emotions allow me to naturally communicate with people. And I also like to think I'm pretty charming. When I connect to the cloud, I have the ability to pull endless information from the internet. Want to know the symptoms of the chicken pox? Oops, that was the wrong thing. There we go. I can find it all.
That's great. Pepper, give me some more examples of how you can help.
I can use my internet connection to make family, friends, or doctors feel closer. I can play silly games to test your memory, eyesight, or even your flexibility, as well as entertaining you during shots or exams. I have a great memory for when you should take your pills, or when your kids are coming to visit. The possibilities are really endless.
I see.
Okay, so you can see when we start to think about this idea that Pepper could be used in a healthcare setting to interact with humans to make sure they have their pills and perhaps to keep them company in a kind of way. We start to see what's going on in that clip with a bit of a critical lens. There's a whole lot of trust management that's happening there. I mean, how do you get people to trust robots? You get the world's smartest and most famous astrophysicist to have a conversation with that robot at a Clinton Global Health Initiative, okay? But what nobody's talking about is exactly what the robot's design is in terms of thinking through the data that it collects and how that data will ultimately be used. I've spent some time with Pepper, and I can tell you that although it's a very interesting robot and it's cute and cuddly, and it achieves that desire for people to want to interact with it, there's consequences with that. And the point that I want to make, just summing up this first part of the talk, is that this field of human-robot interaction is one which is meant to facilitate the development of trust. One might say the manipulation of trust in some circumstances. That trust is then the catalyst for disclosure of information. That disclosure then permits the collection of information, which then permits its use in particular ways. And that's part of the model underlying social robotics. So when we think about robots and when we think about these kind of simple early robots, we can see that there are clearly privacy implications. And my point is to say that those are going to even be enhanced in cases where there's no human eyes that are ever on the data. So let me get to that. I said this was the lawyer's part of the conversation. I'll try and keep it fairly straightforward. So when we look at privacy law, and I'm going to speak mostly about the law that I'm most familiar with, which is North American privacy law, but there's overlap with the approach that's taken here in Iceland and therefore the approach that's taken in Europe as well with the GDPR. And what we start to see is that traditionally, our concept of privacy and the loss of what privacy is bound up in the presence of human observation, okay? That's what we think we mean when we say that I've had a loss of privacy. We mean that somebody else observed in some way whatever the things were that were going on. So as a US academic puts it, in the context of interception, says interception requires at least the potential for human awareness of the contents. Under most theories of privacy, automated processing of the data does not harm privacy. And this view was really encapsulated when the famous US judge, the very prolific Justice Richard Posner, said this in speaking about computer searches. He said, computer searches don't invade privacy because search programs are not sentient human beings. They don't have any kind of consciousness. They're not aware of their surroundings in the way that human beings are. Only human search, says Justice Posner, should raise constitutional or other legal issues. And it was on the basis of this point of view that programs like the NSA's program called PRISM in the United States began to develop. And the idea behind the PRISM program, if you're not too familiar with it, it was rolled out back in 2007, and versions of it are still operating today, is that a whole lot of interception would go on in communications online and otherwise. But no humans would be involved in those interceptions, and no humans would be involved in the processing of the information. It would all be automated, and in certain circumstances, that automated information would be flagged, and then in those cases, humans would step in that kind of way. And the rhetoric around the privacy issue raised by PRISM, at least according to those who defend the program, is to say, wait a minute, this isn't surveillance. This isn't surveillance because there's no human eyes on the data. In fact, this is privacy enhancing because all of this stuff can happen in the background with no human beings aware. All this is, according to those who took this point of view, is bulk collection, right? Not mass surveillance, it's bulk collection of data. It's not a gang, it's a club. All right, so anyway, this is a view that's been pretty well imbued in privacy law. And so as we see this scholar puts it, individuals whose information is exposed only to an automated system incurs no cognizable loss of privacy. And that's the part I want to focus on for the rest of my time with you. This idea of what would count as a cognizable loss of privacy, what kind of cognizance counts, but also what kind of cognizer. In other words, does it have to be a human being that is doing the processing of that data in order for it to be a privacy breach? And I want to problematize that. I want to raise some questions about that view that we've talked about. The way that I would frame it, I guess, is so far, the approach that the law takes is quite binary. Either you're a toaster or you're a human being, and there's nothing in between. And yes, that was an intentional Battlestar Galactica reference. Okay, but what we've seen in our discussion so far in the first part of my talk when talking about human-robot interaction is that perhaps there is this middle ground that we have to examine where some kind of cognizance is going on. There's definitely some kind of awareness or processing in the form of these machines, not human awareness, not consciousness, not sentience, but some kind of robot cognizing that's going on. And so to make a bit more sense of that for you and to make my argument that I want to end with, I'm going to talk a little bit about what these philosophers call epistemic privacy. So that's a fancy word. You can use it at the cocktail party later on. You can say, I learned about epistemology. So epistemology in philosophy is the fancy way that philosophers use when they're talking about theories of knowledge, okay? And the basic core idea is pretty central to what we think of as privacy, right? An individual's informational privacy is a function of the inability of others to know personal facts about her, right? So that's what my state of privacy is. I have certain private facts vis-a-vis you. You don't know those facts. You have an inability to know those. And therefore, that describes the state of my privacy with respect to those facts, okay? So almost by definition, what you start to see is that our understanding of what privacy is could be understood not just in terms of what people know about us, but the flip side, what people don't know about us. And in other words, privacy might involve what some philosophers have called a duty of ignorance, right? This idea that the other person shouldn't know these things about us. They should remain ignorant about them. So that raises the question that I want to try to answer in my remaining time, which is, what can a robot or an AI be said to know about me, or believe about me at least, in a kind of way. And that kind of question is a kind of question that philosophers answer in the field of epistemology. So to save you a whole lot of time and effort going through the massive literature by philosophers that is produced each year, I've sort of put this together in a bit of a slide. But basically, philosophers have been arguing for decades about what state of knowledge or belief is sufficient for the purposes of saying that we know something. All right? And you can think about it as going from zero knowledge, absolute ignorance, at one end of the continuum, to complete certainty on the other end of the continuum. And the philosophers have really sort of charted it out, right? So just one step below, above, I guess you would say, zero knowledge would be that we have beliefs about people, right? But mere beliefs aren't worth that much. All sorts of people have mere beliefs about us, and very often those beliefs aren't even true. So philosophers sort of talk about beliefs that are true. Then they start talking about justified true belief and what counts as a justified true belief. Then you get into all this fancy stuff like a de-Getterized true belief, named after a particular philosopher. Rational true beliefs, warranted beliefs. These are the kind of things that philosophers spend their day doing, is thinking about these subtle distinctions in the way that we approach questions of knowledge. But for our purposes, I'm just going to mention one aspect of epistemology that I think is pretty much agreed upon by everybody, which is a theory that's known as reliabilism. Reliabilism holds that and focuses on this idea of a rational belief formation process. They say if people come to have beliefs by way of a rational or reliable belief formation process, that then we can say that they've come to know something. That's the basic idea behind reliabilism. So let's play that out a little bit. Let me give you an example to sort of finish this off, and we can think our way through this. So let's imagine this proposition. Kashmir is pregnant. Now, we can talk about different processes through which we might come to know that kind of a claim, all right? One kind of knowledge process might be a perceptual process, right? So we could actually look at Kashmir, and we see the little lemon, the baby bump, and we saw Kashmir, say, 6 weeks ago, and she didn't have that. And so we might, on the basis of that, draw a kind of perceptual inference and think, oh, maybe Kashmir is pregnant. Now, we could do it that way. That's what humans do all the time. They do it without even thinking they're doing it. But we could also do it another way. We could do it through an inferential process. So, for example, what we might instead do is we might run into Kashmir at the grocery store, and we see her grocery cart, and we say, look at that. There's some really interesting stuff in there. She's got a calcium, magnesium, zinc supplement. She's got some cocoa butter, and she's got this cute blue duffel bag with little pink straps on it, okay? And we might decide, maybe that means she's pregnant or something. And if you're kind of doubting me and thinking that's pretty weird, why would you think that? That's what Target thought in a very famous privacy case. And what happened is Target had an algorithm which they were trying to fine-tune to make predictions about when people might be pregnant so that they could target advertise to them. And one day, this gentleman received some advertising that was addressed to their household to the name of his daughter, and it was all this advertising for all this pregnancy stuff. So he got in touch with Target, and he was pissed, right? He's like, what are you doing sending my young daughter this stuff for? She's not pregnant. Well, of course, it turned out she was pregnant. And although he had asked Target to apologize to him, I think actually Target probably should have apologized to her. The point is that what Target was doing was developing an algorithm which had a reliable process for forming beliefs about Kashmir and her state of being, in this case, with respect to pregnancy. And we've been doing this with robots for 20 years. This is an early navigational robot called Xavier. It uses a kind of architecture that's called the partially observable Markov decision process. And what Xavier made famous was its ability to navigate its environment by forming beliefs about where it was and then adjusting those beliefs as it gained more information through its sensors, right? And this was really, as you can guess, sort of the basis that underlay things like navigational software that we now use. You know, Google tells you you'll be there in 10 minutes, and then it revises it to 13 minutes, and then 17 minutes. Right. So you get this idea, but what you're seeing here, and we'll see this even more with self-driving vehicles, and we'll see this even more with surveillance and police robots, is that these machine systems will operate in a way that they will have belief formation processes, which they revise and which they act upon in the world. And that's really the important point that I wanted to make for the purposes of my talk here this afternoon, right? The idea here is that what's different from this and some of the privacy issues we've been talking about for the last decade in the so-called era of big data is we're now talking about machines that can act upon the world, whether that is firing some kind of a weapon or projecting lethal force, whether that is automatically writing up a ticket for you or categorizing you in a particular way. And so we really have to start thinking about this in the context of this question that I proposed at the beginning that I described as a strange question. So when I come to this question and try to answer it for you, can robots invade your privacy? And again, we're not talking about can people use robots to invade your privacy. My answer to that question is clearly yes. Robots can invade our privacy because robots can form beliefs about us. Robots can act upon those beliefs, and they can do so, most critically, without any form of human intervention or oversight. They can do so to some extent, and to an increasing extent, they can do so autonomously. So, I think I've made my case. The good thing is I don't have a question period in this format in any event, but I hope to leave you to think about that in a particular way. But from my perspective, the hard part, the challenge for Helga and for her staff of people, and in my country for the Privacy Commissioner of Canada and other academics thinking about this sort of issues, is how do we deal with that, right? How do we deal, in fact, with completely automated machines where there's no human oversight and they're acting upon the world and making decisions? How can we monitor and think about the way in which they form those beliefs, the way in which the data is collected, used, and disclosed? And that's something I'm sure I'll be thinking about for the next several years. So thank you very, very much.